thanks to our speakers once again. Before I talk for a few minutes, very few minutes, about the academic rationale of this event, I just wanted to mention that I know some people were disappointed that this is a male panel, and I understand their frustration. I just wanted to highlight that I worked very hard to get this together. It's a very sensitive issue at the moment. The webinar has a particular structure which I planned since the beginning, and so this didn't help, but I just want to take full responsibility for that, and we will try to do better next time. Speaking of which, on Thursday morning, we are going to interview Valbona Zeneli, who is professor in strategic studies at the Marshall Center of European Security in Berlin. And we're going to talk about the security challenges of the Belt and Road Initiative in Europe. So do check on our YouTube channel at some point over the next few days. So security challenges, this leads me to today's discussion. Why are we here talking about an economy security conundrum in UK-China relations? So from an academic point of view, I think that we always need to remember that with the end of World War II, the United States erected the liberal international order, and this order lies at the intersection between transnational capitalist economy on the one hand, and still the international system of sovereign territorialities, of states. So even if many intellectuals at the end of the Cold War were talking about the end of history, the end of geography, the end of the international security, and the end of the states, states are actually still here with us. So please do allow me very briefly to paraphrase a quote from the Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells, just to make this even more academic than it is. So on the one hand, we still live in a world where social organization is based upon ahistorical, aspatial flows that escape the control of nations, okay? But on the other hand, we still live, in a world where we see political elites who do not want to become flows themselves if they want to preserve their power and continue to dominate others, among other prerogatives. So this is the economy security conundrum in which we all live today. And the bottom line of all this is that states still matters, but they have to manage their security concerns while they get out in the international arena trying to take up the opportunities that the global economy provides. And as we know, this has become an increasingly difficult task, especially if you trade with China, especially if you are a US ally. But actually, given that I study US-China foreign relations, this is a big problem if you are the United States itself. And in fact, I would argue that the economy security conundrum is the biggest in the United States. So this was the academic rationale of this event, which leads me to the policy rationale. Very briefly, I was in Vilnius back in October for a conference on the Belt and Road Initiative. After the conference, we were invited to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where we were chatting with their civil servants, and they were concerned about the fact that China is going to intends to invest in their Klaipeda port. And they asked us, what shall we do? And so my very modest answer was, well, you need to get together, to sit together, people who represent very different competing interests. And that's why today we're here and we have a businessman, a member of parliament, and an academic. We really wanted to have also somebody who is representing security and military interest. Although I worked very hard for this, it was impossible. To an extent, I can understand why things have become really tense between the US and China, and this affects the UK these days. That's all from me. And following the order of in which Michael introduced the guests, I'll hand it over to Mr. Graham.
Please, Mr. Graham, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, or I can do it for you. There we go. There we go.
Great. Well, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. The light is very bright coming in through my window, which may mean the rest of me is in darkness. But I promise you, it's not because I'm trying to hide or be untransparent in any way. So, Michel Groppi, thank you for hosting this. Dr. Leoni, thank you for chairing it. These are big subjects, and I suppose the thoughts that I'm going to offer you today, which are, let me hasten to say, purely my own thoughts, I come from various angles. You've rightly mentioned that I'm chair of the all-party Parliamentary China Group. I'm also chair of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. I'm one of the Prime Minister's trade envoys, and I'm also a member of the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy, which may in some part answer Zeno Leoni's point about having someone from a strategic angle. And of course, wearing different hats, it's possible to look at China in different lights. And the way in which I often look at China, which I think gets forgotten in some of these big piece discussions, is also from the point of view of someone whose wife gave birth to a child in China, whose family grew up with me there for some years, and as someone who has a lot of friends, personal friends in China, people who worked for me or with me there, people I met, did business with, have traveled with in China. And the people-to-people relationship is one that I think, when all is done and said about strategy and so on, is something to remember. There are 100,000 students every year in the UK from China, and they will have made friends while they're here. And those are friendships that we need to cherish and keep over a long period of time. China is very good at long-term friendships, 老朋友, and we're going to need lots of that in an uncertain world. So let me now get to the point and try and offer a few thoughts on the exam question, which these distinguished academics have set us, which is a nice broad one of challenge, opportunities, or both. And of course, the answer to the exam question in one word is both. There are both significant challenges in working with China, whether as a nation, a business, or even as an individual, and there are huge opportunities as well. And it's very easy to define the opportunities as being economic ones and the challenges as being security or strategic ones. I see it as a great deal more nuanced than that. And in general, I think the message I would like to leave today is that in an increasingly connected world, and for a Britain that is trying to move the slogan of Global Britain into a strategy of Global Britain, it is incredibly important to think of shades of grey, and above all, that we deal with the world as it is while working for the world as we would want it to be. So a couple of thoughts on the challenges, then the opportunities, and then a quick summary. And Dr. Leoni, you know, if you want to sort of signal time out when I've exceeded my time or you've had enough of me, then obviously you can either mute me from afar or wave your hand like that. On the challenges side, I think the overall biggest challenge is that China has effectively broken cover on its global ambitions. Its clear stated ambition now is to be the world's superpower by 2030. And in doing so, of course, that has, if you like, upset an assumption by the West that China would coexist with US as the two great superpowers working together in a system of current global multinational rules that were set up by the West, in which China had been very much encouraged to participate for a long time. And the effective reply of the US to this stated ambition is effectively to say, no, you won't. And then to deploy all sorts of arguments and muscle and leverage to try and make sure that that doesn't happen, whether they're trade wars, freedom of navigation, new legislation on Hong Kong, threats to the suppliers of Huawei, you name it, the US is bringing a considerable amount of muscle to bear to try and prevent China from achieving its stated global ambition. And of course, that is a stated global ambition, not just of one particular government, which might come and go in the democratic way of the West, but of a man who is now effectively leader for life. And therefore, this is a direct confrontation with the stated ambition of Xi Jinping as the leader for life. So this makes a very much more tense environment for the world in handling these two large superpowers. And for those who remember, one of the best small volumes I've ever read, which was by Professor Michael Howard, not the politician, but the former professor of history at Oxford, The Causes of War. Michael Howard's The Causes of War series of essays are absolutely brilliant. And a lot of the time, he defines the causes of wars in the ways that the great ancient Greek historians defined them, which is really all about the ambitions of rising powers and the frustrations of powers that may be waning. And so this is a dangerous environment for everyone. And this comes at the same time as the world is increasingly aware of significant human rights abuses in Xinjiang, the province in the northwest, which I know and love dearly. Also, of course, what looks most recently like a near abandonment of the commitment to a high degree of autonomy in Hong Kong by imposing security legislation from Beijing that it cannot pass in Hong Kong itself. Remaining issues around the way in which foreign companies' intellectual properties are politely borrowed, shall we say, by China, especially if they want to set up shop there. And then, of course, most recently, the whole business of COVID-19, which for many people, and particularly those with upcoming elections, is a major cause of frustration and at the same time a stick with which to beat China, where, of course, the virus originates. So all of these things come together at the same time as a realization that the general liberal assumption that China would grow increasingly like us over time may not be true, and that actually the Chinese model of significant autocracy, no real freedom of political rights, and a focus on economic growth is a model that is proving quite attractive to other nations in the world. And so for the first time since 1989, we have seen a decline in the democracy index around the world. And that is something that should concern those of us from democratic countries. So these are the sort of challenges. There are other ones. Everyone will have their own individual and anecdotal stories. I certainly know of academics who, when their views have not entirely coincided with those of the Communist Party of China, have found it hard to get access to travel in China, let alone to do their research, and sometimes their own careers have been under threat. So these challenges strike at the heart of the values of many of the nationals of countries on this conference call, and certainly those of Great Britain. And it's always been a challenge. We have a strategic partnership with China at the moment, which I very much hope continues. But it was over-egged by China to include the phrase the golden era, which I never accepted, never believed in, never used. Because you cannot have a golden era of relations with a country whose starting values are so very different from your own. You can have a strategic partnership, and you should indeed have partnerships with all sorts of countries around the world whose values are different, whose ways of government are rather different, whose approach to human rights is different, and so on. As I say, we deal with the world as it is, and we have to be responsible about that. But to have a golden era is an open goal for journalists every time you have a disagreement. So it is right that that is abandoned, and it is also right, in my view, that we continue to engage very strongly with China because of the opportunities. And so to turn very briefly then to the opportunities, these opportunities effectively stem from the fact that there isn't a single issue in the world that we want to discuss with anyone that doesn't involve China in one way or another. And Simon MacDonald at the Foreign Office has made this clear. Lisa Nandy from the Labour Party has said something very similar. I've always believed this, and that's why I chair the group. It is important for not just politicians and academics, but business people and people of all types to go to China, to learn about it, to understand it, because this is a country and a people we are going to have to deal with for generations to come. They're not going to disappear. They're not going to return to being a large country of whom we don't necessarily need to do very much, as they were before, arguably, 1979, in that sort of 30-year period after the Communist Party came to power. They are absolutely part of the world, and they are part of our system in the UK. They are significant investors here. They're our third biggest trading partner. They are a major component of what makes up the growth of the UK. And employment and jobs is going to be the single biggest challenge facing this government over the next few years. And so if we're going to take forward a strategy of global Britain and build our exports, get the nation trading more, it would be crazy to do anything that shot ourselves in the foot by disengaging with China. And therefore, the role of a sensible and wise government at this stage is to balance the challenges and the opportunities and try not to define our relationships with countries in terms of how much we like or dislike the ruling regime and its particular values. Otherwise, we will end up in all sorts of trouble with at least 60 or 70 countries around the world. We have to look at the issue on an issue-by-issue basis. So when it comes to 5G, we need to understand that post-COVID-19, we're going to need more ways of working efficiently from home. And that means having the best access to super fast broadband everywhere as fast as possible, and ideally as cheaply as possible as well, because we will need what little spending power we have for all sorts of other things, including the NHS and welfare. So that is the sort of balance of challenge and opportunity that I believe we need to have. We need to be building our relationships with Asia in general. We can do that partly through the Trans-Pacific program. We can do that with ASEAN. We can do it with Japan. We can do it with India. There are lots of countries we can do it with, and China should be one of them. And of course, at the same time, we should be able to talk privately about some of the challenges, some of the problems that we identify, which ultimately in the long term will not be good for China. And that for me is the most important thing about the way we go about things, is that where we want to criticize China, it's not because we're better than China or we know better or we've done better. We may not have done so, but it's because our analysis of what will be good for them in the longer term suggests that actually actions, for example, to override the joint declaration in Hong Kong and wave goodbye to a genuine high degree of autonomy about one country and two systems, will not in the longer term be helpful for China's interests. I think we can see that in terms of the US reaction. So I hope those are helpful thoughts for Britain. It's about engagement above all. Thank you very much.
Mr. Graham, thank you very much. And I'll just hand it over to Professor Brown. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Richard and I have already done one other event, I think, a few days ago, and this is the second one. I believe we're going to meet later in the week, so people will start talking, Richard, I think. People will start talking, so we better be discreet about this. I'm going to, so it is an extraordinary thing to see that China now arouses passions in Britain. for a long time, in the 25, 30 years that I've been dealing with China in one way or another, it's sort of always been a sort of bit of a marginal thing. Even relatively recently, quite remote, even when, you know, the golden age was upon us in 2015. And so it is an extraordinary thing to see suddenly, because of COVID-19, an awareness that, wow, there's this huge, you know, kind of place, and it really can impact on us. And, you know, it can impact on this issue, obviously, very problematically and negatively, but it can have all sorts of other impacts. It has aroused passions in British people. And it seems that those passions at the moment are fairly negative. Very little data, but one survey that shows something like 80% of 70%, 80% of British people had a negative view towards China. I don't know how big that survey was, but, you know, even so, in the past, I think our relationship was driven by a sort of elitist, and I don't mean elitist in a sort of political sense. I just mean there was a very small group of people in business, in academia, and in government who did engage very deeply with China, and I knew a huge amount, of whom Richard obviously is one, and Matthew. And then, you know, kind of pretty sort of broadly, not a lot of, you know, kind of other engagement. So it sort of was a very strange structure, very, very kind of, you know, kind of small base at the top, and then really, really nothing. And, you know, one of the kind of examples of that is, I suppose, people who study Chinese studies broadly in Britain at university. I think the figure, it's well known. I think it was about 300 in 1999. And the last time I checked, a couple of years ago, the figure was 286 people graduated from British university studying Chinese language or Chinese studies. There aren't that many universities that really do Chinese studies. And so, you know, it's a kind of strange thing that there's a very, very kind of big rising economy in that time. I guess China's economy since 1999 must have quadrupled at least. And yet in the UK, there's a sort of almost like a static quality until the last few months, when suddenly a great range of politicians who never really thought much about China and kind of just regarded it as being sort of fairly low on their list of priorities, have suddenly acquired sort of a bunch of ideas and sort of notions about China. And I'm sort of interested in that and what will happen because of that. Now, I suppose there's just two things that I'll say in the sort of this introduction before others, you know, speak, and then the discussion. Firstly, I would sort of propose thinking about it as a result of all these passions that we've seen rise in Britain recently. I think that, to be honest, Britain has never had a policy towards China. Never had a policy. It had a policy on Hong Kong because it had to have a policy, and the objectives were all very clear, and I suppose as clear as they could be. It has had a policy on certain issues run via Brussels, on trade, for instance. It has had a security policy, I guess, run via NATO or via Washington, but it's never really had a policy on China. I guess that explains why there's always been this sort of slightly nebulous quality. You know, it's like you ask, I did ask a cabinet minister, you know, about a year ago, what they wanted from China, and they looked at me and said nothing in particular. And so I think that's symptomatic, you know, of this kind of idea that it's sort of, it doesn't merit a policy because it's not really clear what you're going to get from it. There have been aspirations. So the Golden Age was kind of like a vague aspiration. There were figures like, you know, Jim O'Neill, when he was a minister, I suppose, who had specific things about the Belt and Road that they thought about. I guess in 2009, as Adam Tooze, I think in his book Crashed, you know, about the great economic crisis, sort of made clear, London, you know, had a sort of, as a finance centre, had specific things about the internationalisation of renminbi that it wanted from China. But I don't think we've really had a policy, to be absolutely honest with you. And I think that has become more problematic now. We realise that all that time, it seems that we think China had a policy towards us. And I think it probably did have a policy towards us. And so that's a sort of interesting theoretical issue, that if someone has a policy towards you and you don't have a policy towards them, does that mean that you're more flexible? Does it mean that they're more strained? Does it mean in the long term that in fact they are in an advantageous position? So I guess now we're in this position where it is clear that the apathy has been shaken from us. It is clear that for the reasons of leaving the European Customs Union one way or another at the end of this year, which is still the assumption, that in view of the very likely devastating impact in terms of growth and jobs on the British economy, that somehow the world's second biggest economy must have some sort of role in that. And I suppose the thing that I'm going to kind of address is, well, what would that role be? Because that's where the policy will be. So it seems that if you are trying to redo your relationships with your principal partners in Europe without a predictable framework, if we leave without a deal, a customs union deal or a trade deal, if you are also facing the unexpected issue of an America that may have even worse economic problems, where I think before the assumption was that America would be able to deepen its relations with us economically, if you are then going to say in that situation that you still want a very restrained and kind of circumspect and careful relationship with China, I think you've got to have a pretty strong narrative to say why you're not wanting to do more. Because basically the anomaly of the UK as compared to Australia or America, or in fact, I guess even Germany, is that China is not a huge player here. It's not our biggest trading partner. It's not our biggest investor by a long way. I mean, the perception that China is a sort of big player here is a perception. It's just not true. It's actually the world's second biggest economy should be a much, much bigger player here. So it's a bit weird that it is this small player. So it seems to me that poses the question. You have the world's second biggest economy, the situation the UK is in, diplomatically and in terms of its economy, all very, very changed, even from a few months ago. And therefore, that is where you're going to have a strategic decision. I'm going to put it starkly, because I think it will help think through these issues, but I think the position will be this. The policy will be a decision between either saying we reject China's role in our kind of economy because we think the political costs are too high, and the security costs because of our alliance with America and the Five Eyes and all the rest of it is just too big. We reject it. In fact, we're going to see a sort of static or even a declining relationship because the security takes priority. Or we are going to have to embrace a pragmatic, quite a difficult position where we say, okay, do you know what? In fact, economic growth, jobs, all of these things are a part of security. And whether we like it or not, we are going to basically have to deal with this partner in a fundamentally enhanced way. We're going to have to really, really kind of increase our involvement with this partner. And that means that we're going to have to take severe or fairly difficult challenges with some of our security partnerships elsewhere. So I think that is a pretty clear strategic choice. I think if you want to beat up on China, so I mean, basically the era of the standard old rhetoric of we are friends with China, we will always, engage with China, we will tell them that we don't agree about Xinjiang or Hong Kong, but we'll carry on doing business, is over. China is just going to say, do you know what? You can bog off. We're not interested in you patronizing and moralizing about these issues. And at the National People's Congress, do you know what? We're going to stick it to you with severe language on Hong Kong because we just don't want to hear it anymore. So, I mean, and that's caricaturing, but I think that's kind of what we're seeing. And it's going to basically say, you want to deal with us? Cool, we'll deal with you. Very pragmatic, kind of trade-driven relationship, but we don't want any of the old kind of, lectures and claims and stuff like that. We know what your situation is. We're in a kind of similar situation, but we're the world's second biggest economy with a massive rise in consumption, middle class, and you have just turned your back on a bunch of allies and all the rest of it. So what are you going to do? So I think that's a pause for us to think about. That is a point of making a strategic choice and a policy. I'm putting it starkly. I'm sure many people will correct me and say that this is maybe kind of too simplistic, but from where I sit, this seems to me the choice we have to take. And whether politicians like it or not, if they don't take the choice, Either the British public will, which would be an interesting choice, or China, which will be even more interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. Matthew Rous, please.
Thank you, and hello everyone. It's great to be with you today. And I guess I have the same exam question as Richard and Kerry to say whether I think China is a challenge or an opportunity. Of course, it's both. And there are real challenges in dealing with a nation like China. If there weren't, we wouldn't be having this dialogue today. At the China-Britain Business Council, we're sometimes accused of being rather naive panda huggers, you know, greedy capitalists driven by the profit motive, are willing to overlook all the more uncomfortable side of the relationship, when in fact, you know, most of us have spent a good number of years working and living in China, and so have experienced at first hand the frustrations, the pitfalls of dealing with a very different system, with very different values, very different political choices and trade-offs. I suppose, you know, as both Richard and Kerry have said, the huge difference now in the last couple of months is that COVID-19 has brought China suddenly into this very sharp and visible focus. And that's really what's activating this call from many corners of the British political system to, well, get real is the phrase that's been used by one former chief of staff at Number 10, or if you want to put it another way, to have that kind of coherent, hard-nosed strategy that Kerry was talking about just now. I mean, I think getting real about China in the context of China has to mean understanding the depth of the relationship. The economic relationship in particular is what we focus on at CBBC, and we think that we have a good understanding of the nuts and bolts of what works in practical terms and what doesn't. And a lot has been working pretty well in recent years. You know, in the last 10 years, we've had something like 1,000 investment projects in the UK from China. That's directly created something like 25,000 jobs. And if you add on the supply chains, you know, the partners in the supply chain and people supplying them and their families, you rapidly get to a place where you have a lot of British households invested in the success of this relationship. And that doesn't mean that you want to become dependent. You know, you don't want to become dependent on any commercial partner, certainly not in security terms. But I think we're a long way from that. And you know, what I would argue is that we need a clear-headed approach in this country, particularly in the context of post-Brexit, to make sure that the economic relationship is an advantageous one, and that then increases UK's security as well. I mean, security comes ultimately from economic power. Armed forces, intelligence agencies, soft power assets like the BBC. These all have to be paid for, and that money is money we earn from doing trade. The UK economy is hurting right now, and it's going to be hurting for quite some time, along with you know, most of our partners and competitors out there in the global market. There are strong signs already that China is bouncing back faster from COVID than other nations, mainly because it went into COVID first, and that means that our ties with China are going to be incredibly important in terms of ensuring resilience in the short term. But I think the trends are clear that this is something that isn't going to change for the long term either. You know, last year we had another record year. We exported something like £32.5 billion worth of goods directly to China, and our exports have increased fivefold just in the last 10 years. If you subscribe to the importance of the red wall hypothesis, or, you know, I should probably say blue wall these days, you know, a lot of those exports are coming from the north, from Scotland, from the Midlands. London and the South East actually only accounted for less than 20% of UK exports last year. So it's really important to building that cohesion. But it's not all just, you know, filling container ships. Behind the figures, there are a lot of really interesting stories of British creativity. You've got the phenomenon that is Peppa Pig, which is storming China at the moment. You've got the British Museum, the Tate, the V&A, the British Library, the Royal Shakespeare Company all touring. And of course, you've got huge numbers of Chinese tourists, something like 400,000 last year, all flocking to Bicester Village to do their shopping, getting on for 200,000 students, 120,000 certainly in the university sector, and an increasing number in the secondary sector too. And if you were sitting in the the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party at the moment, you might look at all of this and think, well, each purchase of a Peppa Pig product is a little act of subversion, which might bring down the system eventually. Look, there are challenges. Of course, there are challenges for us too in the relationship with China. And given the UK's long history in Hong Kong, of course, it's right to be concerned about what's going on there. Of course, it's right to be concerned what's happening in Xinjiang, which is a very worrying situation. But if you believe that those facts on the ground need to change and you want to have influence on that, then you've absolutely got to engage. You've got to entrench yourself as a partner in a comprehensive relationship, comprehensive strategic partnership was the phrase that was used at the time of the state visit and the launch of the so-called golden era. And what does that actually mean if it's not just jargon? It means that you're a valued and respected partner and that you have influence when it comes to talking about these issues, provided that you can find a way of talking about them in a way that resounds. And in the case of China, hectoring from the sidelines, it may make you feel rather good in the short term, but it doesn't have a great history of working, as I think as the Americans are discovering currently. And I think there are lessons that we can usefully learn from the Chinese ourselves as we calibrate our approach. Zhou Enlai, who was the first premier of China after 1949, took a very wily approach to international relations. He used to frequently deploy a phrase that came from the thousands-year-old Confucian tradition, and said that China should seek common ground while preserving differences. In other words, play a very long game in its relations with the rest of the world, looking to work together with partners in the West where that was possible, but hanging on to those core values. Now, Kerry may be right that balance is shifting 2 generations on. We may be seeing a much more assertive Chinese approach, and we shall see what happens in the next few years. But I think it's clear that we're going to have to be nimble in our diplomacy. We can't behave as the Emperor Qianlong did back in the 1790s and just send the foreigners packing. We can't send Lord Macartney home with no goodies. We need to be as smart as the Chinese themselves, maintaining the engagement, including on the commercial front, to be making sure that we've got our share of the China dividend. Because if we don't do that, our competitors will happily gobble that up. But also, use that engagement to bind China ever closer into a relationship where it's about free markets and level playing fields and transparency, and bringing China into a world economic order. The liberal economic order, you called it, Zeno, and said it was an American invention in 1945. Well, I think it wasn't that the British Empire that had quite a lot to do with that. The economic order remains fundamentally Anglo-Saxon, and it would be a grave matter if we pushed China away from that. If our first move, strategic gambit after Brexit was to write off a country of 1.4 million people. So there we are. That's my case for engagement. I think I'll leave it there because we want to get into a debate. But I hope that all makes sense.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rous. So I was wondering, before we ask for some questions from the audience, if we could have a shorter second round. I was just wondering whether there are any reactions to what you have all been saying so far, and if we could start again from Mr. Graham, if that's okay.
Hi, thanks, Dr. Leoni. Sorry, my muting and unmuting skills still need improvement to reach a sophisticated university threshold competency test. Look, I think the only thing I would say is that, I mean, Kerry has done well to phrase it all as a sort of very blunt, either or option, which is ideal for this sort of debate. Either you take the view of having static or even declining business relationship because of your security or political concerns, or you increase the involvement with the argument that jobs and employment are actually the most important part of security. And he rightly said that in reality, Britain will never make that sort of choice. The great advantage of democratic countries, and I'm using the phrase advantage, with the tongue halfway through my cheek, is that we're not very good at making these long strategic decisions on what our relationships with other countries should be. We're pragmatic. There is a framework that runs from election to election, and depending on what happens, a new government will fine-tune the process. I think Lord Salisbury called it, in terms of foreign policy, drifting gently down the river with occasionally putting a paddle into the water to make sure you didn't crash into one side or the other. And so I think we will, to use a phrase that the EU like to use about us quite a lot over the last year, we will want to have our cake and eat it. We will want to be able to do, as Matthew was suggesting, really, we'll do the duo and lie thing of seeking common ground, of which there is a huge amount. Let's not forget that. Strategically, there is a lot where we do work very closely with China, whether it's Somali pirates or a whole range of other stuff, while preserving the differences. And it's quite right and proper that we should recognize the differences. China reckons that they have a superior system. Whether that's true for them or not is largely the call of the Chinese people, just as they probably have a view on whether democracy is working well for us, but recognize that that is for the British people to decide. So I do think that we don't have to decide for or against China. We want to be with China on a whole range of issues, and we will beg to differ on a smaller number of significant other ones.
Thank you. Professor Brown.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I guess there's two things. I think it's not for or against. I think it's really working out what we're dealing with. The problem is that I think there's two huge conceptual issues when we talk about China. One is that it seems there's a lack of clarity between whether we think China is a threat because it's a proselytizer. It wants to dominate a world that looks like it. Or whether, in fact, China is a threat because it's so self-interested and it just sort of basically dives into the world, takes what it wants, and it doesn't actually want to proselytize. It just doesn't even bother with that. It wants what works for it. And so it's kind of quite selfish. And I think a lot of the time, the assumption is that China is the dominant, proselytizer. It wants to spread its values and its kind of worldview. And I think I'm very skeptical about that. I think China's behavior is more latter, that it's self-interested, almost sociopathological. It just wants what works for it. And that's the problem. If we were dealing with a proselytizer, I think we'd have kind of been able to come up with a strategy. But we're dealing with a non-proselytizer, but quite a dominant entity. And, that's a totally different kind of, that's never really been seen before, values were always very transferable in modern times between, Great Britain and then America, has sort of really been promoting its values. They're very transferable, freedom, kind of all the sort of the things that the American, values are meant to encapsulate. They don't have to be American. They're sort of like Enlightenment values. And I think this has really been the sticking point. We have been pointing our guns in the wrong direction. The proselytizer never came, but the sociopath did. That seems to me what's tripped us up. And I suppose the second thing in terms of our knowledge is we are, I hear it all the time. We love the communists. We love the Chinese people. We don't like the Communist Party. The Communist Party bad, Chinese people good. And I mean, I just don't think that's true. I mean, funny enough, the Communist Party of China is 90 million Chinese people. And secondly, I think the problem is probably the unbelievable hunger and aspirations, ambitions of Chinese people. They want everything yesterday. When you go to Shanghai or Beijing, you can feel this energy. And that seems to me to be the more terrifying thing. And that's not something one can make a moral judgment on. It's just that kind of, we see this extraordinary hunger to sort of, for Chinese people to have their moment, and who can deny that? And while kind of banging on about, the evils of the Communist Party of China, the Communist Party of China is the servant of this aspirational, rising sort of, middle-class population. And that's the kind of group that's going to decide everything, right? And if they walk, well, then the party's over. I mean, I know that's unlikely to happen, but, we need to kind of work out conceptually. We would be really deluding ourselves if we thought it was just an issue of the party. No, I'm afraid it's way more complex than that. My Chinese students, maybe some who might be listening, or kind of my Chinese colleagues, their aspirations are their aspirations, nothing to do with the party. Very complicated. Their nationalism maybe is, kind of it belongs to them. It's no good trying to kind of dismiss this because, it's the Communist Party of China brainwashing people. I'm afraid not. My experience is it's really not. And I guess the final thing I'll say, it really haunts me. I mean, I think a couple of years ago I was in a thing, and I think it was Austria, and a person there said, we're always 10 years behind. And I got the Financial Times yesterday. Big mistake, anyway, because it always puts me in a terrible mood for a week. And, so I only read it on Saturdays, gives me the weekend to recover. And it said it had one article by their writer, Wolfgang Muncher, about EU needs to be united. China's picking the EU apart, on China. Well, tell me some news, right? I thought I was reading something from the archives 15 years ago. It's been doing that for years. This is not news. This is not news. And then there was Tom Turgent talking about, some sort of issue about we need to be tough on China and tell them exactly where we're coming from. Well, yeah, I remember as a diplomat we did that, yeah. And it's like, oh, no, it wasn't that. It was like, we need to protect our innovation. Chinese companies are coming and stealing it. Has anyone pointed out that in AI, in many areas of research, in automotive, in so many areas, China is actually quite a long way ahead now? The mindset of China being innovatively, the innovative pauper is just no longer true. It is happening. It's the heart of the US-China issue. This is the problem. China's succeeding. And I mean, Matthew's point is right. I mean, about the kind of global finance system. But I think I would put it in I slightly put it in a different way. The problem is not that China will walk away from capitalism. The problem is that the greatest practitioner of capitalism in the world today is China. It is the greatest capitalist, and yet it's a communist country. It has totally screwed our narratives. I mean, that was definitely not meant to happen. So to me, that is the kind of issue, the issue of our conceptual frameworks are just not robust. They just see the wrong thing. I think when I'm hearing these discussions, I feel like we're talking about the evil party and the good people. We're talking about, kind of the sort of China, the proselytizer, whereas I think it's China, the sociopath. And the second thing, I guess, is that we're 10 years out of date. This discussions I'm having now, it's all very academic. Richard's right. It's academic because it should have happened 15 years ago. But it's now, we're kind of rearranging all of the deck chairs, not on a sinking Titanic, of course, but on a ship that's going in a different direction to the way we thought. and unless we radically rethink how we, how our attitude, knowledge, and conceptual framework towards the thing we're thinking about, the way we think, we're going to have all of our agency and our ability taken away from us. So I think that's critical. That's absolutely critical. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Professor Brown. Mr. Rous.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll say a few more things, although I think we've covered it pretty well in the discussion. I mean, seeking common ground. There is common ground between what the three of us have said on some points. I agree that we are now having to deal with and respond to a China which is suddenly much more assertive, particularly when it comes to addressing its so-called core interests: Hong Kong, Taiwan, the South China Sea. These are going to remain challenging and incredibly difficult issues, and that is to do with the substance. But probably what we're noticing most at the moment is the difference of tone, the different presentation. You know, gone is Deng Xiaoping's talk of biding your time and hiding your strength, right? Because this is suddenly a lot more macho and in your face. But I do believe that China is much bigger than the CCP, and that the CCP is bigger than one man for that matter. It's not just the old cliche about a 5,000-year civilization. You've got real contending approaches there in the society. I lived in China most recently in 2017, and yes, I was struck by a very strong sense of nationalism and national pride around me. At that time, I was living in Guangzhou, which is a very international and cosmopolitan city, but that sense of China standing up was very strong and very forcefully expressed. And that's very understandable in a country which suffered more than a century of humiliation, really, imposed by the outside world. But much more visible than that even was straightforward consumerism, materialism. People wanting the good life. Yes, everybody wants everything yesterday, but not because they want to be overtaking America, but because they want to be overtaking the Joneses or the Wangs or the Zhangs who live next door. And so, China does want the good things that engagement with the West has to offer. I think Chinese people know that the British education system is one of the best in the world. Otherwise, why would Chinese students come to the UK in such large numbers? The UK's creative industries and great brands are much respected. A lot of Chinese investment in the UK is because of huge respect in which our R&D and our design is held. And these are assets that we have to deploy smartly and savvily in a way that reflects enlightened understanding of our own self-interest. Yes, it is right that China is suddenly the most macho-style capitalist economy in the world, but in a sense, it's not caught up with 21st century liberal capitalism. It's still quite an old-fashioned national state capitalism, mercantilist approach. In some ways, it still feels like the France of Colbert and Louis XIII, right? And so there's still plenty to play for, is I think my core message. The game is not yet up, and yes, let's have a strategy which allows us to engage intelligently, pursue our self-interest, and call me naive, but I believe they're right when they talk about win-win. Engagement is good for all of us, and that's what I'm all for.